Exercise won't save you, not by itself. You can run 5 miles a day, lift weights 3 times a week, close your fitness ring, and still develop heart disease, diabetes, or chronic pain. In fact, some of the most physically active people in modern societies still struggle with metabolic illness. That sounds wrong, but it isn't. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Exercise is not the same thing as physical activity, and your body knows the difference. Today, we spend more than 10 hours a day sitting. More than 40% of adults in industrialized nations meet recommended exercise guidelines, yet rates of obesity and metabolic disease continue to rise. That contradiction should make you pause, because if exercise were the solution, we would already be healthy. So what's missing? The answer begins more than 2 million years ago. Your body was not designed for scheduled workouts. It was shaped by natural selection in environments where movement was constant, necessary, and woven into survival itself. There were no rest days, there were no treadmills, there was no such thing as compensating for 10 hours of sitting with 40 minutes of effort. And this creates a problem no one anticipated. What if the very concept of exercise as something optional, separate, and time-bound is an evolutionary mismatch? You are not lazy, you are not weak, and you are certainly not broken. You are living in a world your body did not evolve for. I'm Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I've spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, and survive. Now, I'm here to help you understand why your Stone Age body struggles in a modern world and exactly how to fix it. Welcome to the evolution. If you value clear thinking grounded in evolutionary science, not trends, not hacks, but deep understanding, consider subscribing. This channel is about learning how your ancient biology shapes your modern life, because once you understand the design, everything changes. And to see why exercise alone won't save you, we need to go back to the beginning. Let's go back roughly 2 million years. Imagine a small group of hunter-gatherers moving slowly across a dry savanna. Not sprinting, not training, just living. They wake with the sun, they walk several miles to gather tubers, they dig, they carry children, they climb. Occasionally, they run, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, tracking an antelope until it overheats. Movement was not a choice, it was survival. But here's the important detail. It wasn't extreme. The average hunter-gatherer likely burned about 3,000 calories a day, yet studies of modern foraging populations show something surprising. Their total daily energy expenditure isn't dramatically higher than that of Western office workers. Pause there. That finding overturns a major assumption. We often imagine our ancestors as constantly exhausted, operating at the edge of physical collapse. But natural selection doesn't favor waste. It favors efficiency. The human body evolved to conserve energy whenever possible. This is the part most people miss. Our ancestors were physically active, yes, but they were also strategic. They rested when they could. They avoided unnecessary exertion. If food was scarce, conserving energy increased survival. Laziness, in that context, wasn't a flaw. It was adaptive. Your instincts are doing exactly what they evolved to do. When you choose the elevator over the stairs, that impulse has deep roots. When you feel resistance before a workout, that hesitation isn't moral failure. It's ancient biology protecting fuel. And yet, those same bodies were exposed to something radically different from modern life. Frequent, low-intensity movement distributed across the entire day. Walking, squatting, lifting, carrying, standing. Not 90 minutes of intensity followed by 10 hours of sitting. And that distinction matters more than we once thought. In ancestral environments, muscle contractions were constant signals. They regulated blood sugar. They stimulated circulation. They maintained bone density. They communicated with the immune system. Movement wasn't just about burning calories, it was information. Every time your muscles contract, they release molecules, myokines, that influence metabolism and inflammation. These signals evolved under conditions of regular, habitual use. Remove that baseline activity, and something subtle happens. The system begins to recalibrate. Your body reduces insulin sensitivity, blood flow patterns shift, muscle fibers atrophy, even brain chemistry changes, not dramatically at first, quietly, gradually. And here's where the misunderstanding begins. When we add a workout to an otherwise sedentary life, we assume we are restoring what was lost, but evolution didn't shape us for isolated bursts of activity layered on top of prolonged stillness. It shaped us for movement as a default state. That difference between default movement and scheduled exercise is the evolutionary gap. Now consider the modern pattern. You sit at a desk, you commute in a car, you relax on a couch, then at 6 p.m., you attempt to compress ancestral activity into a 45-minute session. It's admirable, but biologically, it's incomplete. Because the body doesn't interpret that workout as a return to its natural baseline. It interprets it as a stressor layered onto a sedentary background. And this creates a problem no one anticipated. The problem is not that exercise is bad. Exercise is extraordinary. It strengthens the heart, builds muscle, sharpens cognition. The problem is that exercise cannot fully compensate for chronic inactivity. That distinction may seem subtle, it isn't. It reframes the entire conversation about health. And to understand why, we have to examine what prolonged sitting actually does to a Stone Age body in a modern chair. Now let's step into the present. You wake up, you sit at breakfast, you sit in a car, you sit at a desk, you sit at lunch, you sit in meetings, you sit at dinner, you sit to unwind. By the end of the day, you may have exercised for 40 minutes and remained sedentary for 10 hours. From an evolutionary perspective, that ratio is unprecedented. Here's what happens inside your body when you sit for long, uninterrupted periods. Within minutes, electrical activity in the large muscles of your legs drops dramatically. Blood flow slows. An enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, critical for breaking down fats in the bloodstream, declines. That's not after years, that's after hours. Insulin sensitivity begins to fall. Glucose remains elevated longer. Your metabolism subtly shifts towards storage rather than use. Now pause for a moment. None of this feels dramatic. You don't feel sick. You don't feel damaged. You simply feel still. But your biology reads stillness differently. Remember, for most of human evolution, prolonged immobility signaled illness, injury, or starvation. Stillness was not neutral. It was a warning state. And this is where everything changes. When stillness becomes the daily default rather than a temporary condition, the body adapts accordingly. Muscles weaken. Mitochondria become less efficient. Posture shifts. Connective tissues stiffen. Then we add exercise. The workout is beneficial, yes. It stimulates growth and repair, but it does not fully reverse the metabolic signals accumulated during prolonged sitting. In fact, large epidemiological studies show that individuals who exercise regularly but remain sedentary for most of the day still face elevated risks of cardiovascular disease compared to those who move frequently throughout the day, even at lower intensities. That finding is uncomfortable. It challenges the cultural story that as long as you work out, you're fine. But that assumption is wrong. This is not a failure of effort. It's a mismatch of context. Your Stone Age physiology expects movement to be woven into existence, not compartmentalized into a time slot. Let me give you a simple example. Consider two individuals. One jogs for 30 minutes every morning, but works at a desk the rest of the day. The other does not jog, but walks intermittently, stands often, lifts groceries, climbs stairs, and accumulates low-intensity movement across 10 hours. From an evolutionary perspective, the second pattern more closely resembles the environment in which our metabolic systems evolved. That realization surprises many people. It doesn't mean structured exercise is unnecessary. It means exercise is not the whole story. And here's the deeper issue. Modern comfort removes friction. We outsource movement to machines. We minimize physical effort. We design environments for efficiency, not physiology. Chairs, elevators, food delivery, climate control, none of these are inherently harmful, but together they create a landscape of chronic underuse. And underuse has consequences. Bone requires load. Muscle requires tension. Circulation requires contraction. Even the brain benefits from regular bodily movement. Remove those signals, and systems recalibrate downward. This is not punishment, it's adaptation. Your body is extraordinarily responsive to its environment. If you signal sit, it adapts to sitting. If you signal move, it adapts to movement. The tragedy is not that we exercise too little, it's that we misunderstand the baseline our biology expects. And that leads to a surprising realization. The real solution may not be harder workouts. It may be re-engineering the environment so that movement becomes unavoidable again. But to see why willpower alone rarely solves this problem, we need to examine the psychology of energy conservation, an instinct millions of years in the making. Here's the part most people miss. The problem is not that we dislike exercise. The problem is that we evolved to avoid unnecessary exertion. That sentence sounds controversial in modern culture, but evolution does not reward constant effort. It rewards efficient survival. For most of human history, calories were scarce. Movement was essential, but only when it served a purpose. Finding food, escaping danger, building shelter. If our ancestors had voluntarily burned excess energy for no reason, they would have reduced their chances of survival. So natural selection shaped a brain that prefers to conserve effort whenever possible. This is not weakness. It's design. When you feel resistance before going to the gym, that sensation is not moral failure. It is an ancient cost-benefit calculation unfolding beneath awareness. Your brain is asking, is this necessary? In ancestral environments, the answer was clear. If movement was required for survival, you moved. If not, you rested. But modern exercise is abstract. Running on a treadmill does not gather food. Lifting weights does not build shelter. Your brain recognizes effort, but it does not recognize survival. And that's where the real misunderstanding begins. We assume health behaviors fail because people lack discipline. But from an evolutionary perspective, the challenge is structural, not personal. You are not broken. You are responding exactly as a well-designed organism should respond in an energy-rich environment with minimal survival demands. Let me share a brief example. A colleague of mine, let's call him Michael, was a committed runner. He logged 20 miles a week. He prided himself on consistency, yet his blood sugar levels were creeping upward. His lower back ached constantly. He felt fatigued by mid-afternoon. He was confused. He was doing everything right. When we looked closer, the pattern emerged. He ran in the morning, then sat for nearly 9 hours each day. He drove home. He rested in the evening. His exercise was real, but his baseline was stillness. We made one simple change. Not more intensity, not longer runs. We restructured his environment, standing meetings, walking phone calls, a desk positioned higher, short movement breaks every hour, light resistance movements during the day. Within months, his metabolic markers improved, his back pain diminished, his energy stabilized, nothing extreme happened, but the signal changed, and that's the key insight. Your body does not respond primarily to isolated heroic effort. It responds to repeated environmental cues. If the cue is sit, it adapts downward. If the cue is move frequently, it adapts upward. Now pause here. This reframes the entire narrative about exercise. The goal is not to defeat your biology. The goal is to work with it, which leads to a surprising realization. Willpower is fragile because it fights instinct. Environment is powerful because it reshapes instinct. In ancestral settings, movement was built into daily life. There was no decision fatigue, no negotiation, no calendar slot required, and this creates a problem no one anticipated in the modern world. We've made movement optional. Optional behaviors compete with comfort, convenience, and cognitive fatigue. And comfort usually wins. But what if we stopped asking ourselves to override millions of years of evolutionary programming? What if instead we redesigned our surroundings so that movement became the path of least resistance again? That shift from self-blame to environmental design is where the real solution begins. And to fully understand how to implement it, we need to step back and clarify the core principle behind everything we've discussed so far. Let's step back for a moment. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Exercise is powerful, but it cannot compensate for a sedentary baseline your body never evolved to tolerate. That is the core thesis. Your Stone Age physiology expects frequent, low-level movement across the day, not intensity layered on top of stillness. Now, this is not an argument against exercise. Far from it. Running strengthens the cardiovascular system. Resistance training preserves muscle mass and bone density. High-intensity effort improves mitochondrial capacity. Those adaptations matter, especially as we age. But here's the distinction. Exercise is a stimulus. Baseline movement is a biological requirement, and requirements cannot be compressed indefinitely. You cannot sleep 2 hours per night and make up for it on Sunday. You cannot eat nothing all day and consume all nutrients in one meal. Similarly, you cannot remain immobile for 10 hours and fully undo it in 40 minutes. The body keeps score differently. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means shifting from a workout-centric model to an environment-centric model. In ancestral settings, people did not schedule activity. They structured life around necessity. Food required walking, water required carrying, social life required gathering physically. Movement was friction embedded in daily existence. Modern design removes friction, so we must reintroduce it deliberately. And this is where everything becomes surprisingly simple. Stand while reading email. Walk during phone calls. Place objects farther away. Choose stairs not as a test of virtue, but as a default route. Short bursts, frequent interruptions, light loads. These are not dramatic changes, but they restore something ancient. Remember, muscle contraction is biochemical communication. Each contraction releases signals that regulate blood sugar, lipid metabolism, and inflammation. The body does not require heroics. It requires consistency. Now, here's a culturally contrarian insight. We celebrate extreme fitness transformations. We admire discipline and intensity. But from an evolutionary perspective, the healthiest pattern may look remarkably ordinary: steady walking, carrying groceries, gardening, standing conversations. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but biologically aligned. You are not meant to live in a chair. That sentence may sound obvious, yet modern architecture, technology, and workflow quietly assume that you will. And over years, that assumption shapes physiology, which leads to another identity shift. You do not need to become more extreme. You need to become more aligned. That alignment reduces the psychological burden of exercise because now your workouts complement a moving baseline rather than attempting to rescue a sedentary one. Here's another way to frame it. Think of exercise as a spice. Baseline movement is the meal. Spice enhances. It does not replace. Now imagine aging under two conditions. In one scenario, muscle mass declines from decades of underuse, interrupted occasionally by sporadic exercise attempts. In the other, daily life continuously reinforces low-level strength, balance, and mobility, supplemented by structured training. Which body enters its 70s with greater resilience? The answer is not mysterious, and this creates a hopeful realization. You do not need more motivation. You need a different default. Once the environment shifts, behavior follows with far less resistance, because your instincts are not the enemy, they are signals. And when the environment matches your evolutionary design, health stops feeling like a constant uphill battle. But there is one final implication of this mismatch that matters deeply, especially for longevity, and that's where we're going next. Here's the long-term consequence few people consider. When baseline movement disappears, aging accelerates, quietly, incrementally. Muscle mass declines at roughly 1% per year after midlife. Strength declines even faster. Bone density follows a similar trajectory. Those changes are not purely chronological. They are environmental. Use preserves tissue. Disuse removes it. In ancestral environments, even older adults walked daily, carried loads, rose from the ground repeatedly, and remained socially and physically engaged. They were not training for marathons. They were participating in life, and participation required movement. Now compare that to modern aging. Retirement often reduces daily steps. Chairs become more comfortable. Tasks become outsourced. The environment grows increasingly frictionless. The body interprets that reduction as a signal: less demand, less adaptation, and this creates a problem no one anticipated. We assume decline is inevitable, but much of what we call natural aging is amplified by mismatch. This is not denial of biology. Aging is real. Entropy exists, but trajectory matters. Two individuals can share the same chronological age and inhabit radically different physical realities depending on lifelong movement patterns. One enters older adulthood with preserved muscle, stable insulin sensitivity, resilient balance. The other enters with fragility, stiffness, and metabolic instability. The divergence often began decades earlier with baseline inactivity. Now pause for a moment. This should not induce fear. It should induce clarity, because the intervention is not extreme. Frequent walking, regular load bearing, rising from the floor, carrying weight, interrupting sitting, simple behaviors repeated thousands of times across years compound into structural resilience. This response makes evolutionary sense. Your body evolved to assume that if you survived into later life, you were still contributing, gathering, teaching, maintaining social bonds. Movement remained integrated. Longevity was not passive, it was active. And here is the deeper cultural shift. We often treat exercise as insurance against disease, a protective shield. But movement is not medicine in the way we imagine. It is maintenance of a design that expects use. You are not fighting aging. You are signaling relevance to your biology. That is a profound reframing. Exercise alone won't save you because health is not built in isolated episodes. It is built in repeated alignment between environment and evolutionary expectation. Once you understand that, the strategy changes. You stop asking, did I work out today? You start asking, did my day require my body? And that question extends beyond metabolism. It touches purpose, engagement, autonomy, which leads to one final reflection. If modern life removes the necessity for movement, then reclaiming health is not about intensity. It's about restoring necessity intelligently, deliberately, sustainably. Because the goal is not to train harder. It is to live in a way your biology recognizes. And once you do, something remarkable happens. Health stops feeling like rescue. It starts feeling like continuity.